The more you try to be liked, the more invisible you become. The more you prove your worth, the less anyone believes it. You think if you are kind enough, patient enough, understanding enough, people will finally see your value. But actually, the more you do that, the more they quietly place you lower in their internal hierarchy. And most people never realize this. They think life is unfair. They think people are shallow. They think they just haven't met the right environment yet. But the truth is much colder than that. You are not being overlooked by accident. You are being positioned by your own behavior. You don't notice it at first. It starts small. You reply too fast. You agree too easily. You laugh when something isn't even funny. You say yes when your mind is screaming no. And every time you do that, something subtle happens. Not outside, but inside the other person's perception. They begin to feel that you are easy, accessible, replaceable. Not because you are weak, but because you reveal too much need. And need is the one signal that destroys perceived value faster than anything else. You've probably felt it before without understanding it. That moment when you give more effort than the other person. That moment when you care more, try more, invest more, and somehow they pull away. You become confused. You think, why am I losing them when I'm giving my best? But that question itself reveals the deeper problem. You believe value comes from giving more. It doesn't. Value comes from what you are willing to withhold. And that idea is uncomfortable, because it goes against everything you've been taught. You were told to be open, to be expressive, to show effort, to prove sincerity. No one told you that the world doesn't reward effort. It rewards perception. And perception is not built on what you show. It's built on what people have to figure out about you. When everything about you is obvious, explained, and available, there is nothing left to discover. And when there is nothing left to discover, there is no reason to stay curious. And without curiosity, there is no perceived value. This is why you feel like you are always the one chasing, always the one maintaining connections, always the one trying to keep things alive. Because deep down, you are afraid of being forgotten. So you overcompensate. You become louder, more present, more giving. But what you don't see is that this effort creates the exact outcome you're trying to avoid. You train people to expect you, and once something is expected, it is no longer valued. Think about it. The moment something becomes guaranteed, it loses its emotional weight. Your presence becomes background noise. Your words become predictable. Your attention becomes cheap. And no one consciously decides to devalue you. It happens automatically, psychologically, beneath awareness. That's how dangerous this pattern is. It doesn't look like failure. It looks like being nice. It looks like being a good person. But under the surface, it slowly erodes how people perceive you. And the worst part is, you reinforce it every single day. You check your phone too often. You wait for replies. You analyze conversations. You replay moments in your head, wondering what you could have said better. You think the solution is optimization, saying the right words, acting the right way. But the real issue is not what you say. It's how much you reveal that you care about the outcome. Because the moment you are emotionally invested in being accepted, you lose leverage. And leverage is the foundation of high-value perception. This is not about manipulation. This is about understanding a truth that most people are too uncomfortable to face. People are drawn to what feels scarce, grounded, and self-contained, not to what feels available, reactive, and seeking. And right now, if you're honest with yourself, you are operating from seeking. You are trying to be chosen, trying to be seen, trying to be enough. And that energy leaks through everything you do, in your tone, in your timing, in your presence. You can hide it with words, but you can't hide it psychologically. People feel it, and when they feel it, they instinctively move away, even if they can't explain why. So the problem is not that you are not valuable. The problem is that you are displaying your value in a way that lowers its perceived worth. You are over-delivering in the wrong dimension. You are giving access instead of creating curiosity. You are giving reassurance instead of creating tension. You are giving consistency instead of creating unpredictability. And without tension, without uncertainty, without a slight emotional gap, there is no reason for anyone to lean in. Everything becomes flat, safe, forgettable, and you become the person who is nice but never respected, present but never prioritized, available but never desired. Now here is the uncomfortable shift you need to make. You don't fix this by doing more. You fix this by removing what is unnecessary. You slow down your responses, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of a life that is not centered around others. You stop explaining your decisions. You let silence exist, even when it feels awkward. You allow people to misunderstand you without rushing to correct them. Because the moment you stop trying to control how others see you, something changes. Your presence becomes heavier. Your words carry more weight. Your absence becomes noticeable. And suddenly, without chasing, you are being observed differently. This is the beginning of high-value psychology, not adding layers, but removing the need to be validated. But most people will never reach this point, because it requires you to sit with discomfort. The discomfort of not being liked by everyone. The discomfort of not being immediately understood. The discomfort of not chasing closure. And most people can't handle that, so they go back to what feels safe. Over-giving, over-explaining, over-trying. And they stay stuck in the same loop. But if you're still here, something in you already knows this is true. You've felt the imbalance. You've noticed the pattern. You've experienced the quiet shift in how people treat you when you give too much. And now, you're starting to see it clearly. Not emotionally, but structurally. And that awareness is where everything begins to change. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once you understand the psychology behind it, you stop playing the game blindly. You stop reacting. You start choosing. And that shift, from reacting to choosing, is the line that separates low perceived value from high-value individuals. You were taught that the more you give, the more you matter. But reality quietly punishes that belief. Because the more you give without restraint, the more you signal that what you give has no cost. And when something has no cost, the human mind assigns it no value, not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. Because value is not calculated by effort. It is felt through contrast, through scarcity, through the subtle tension between access and limitation. And the moment you remove that tension by making yourself constantly available, constantly agreeable, constantly predictable, you flatten your own presence into something safe but forgettable. And that is the first illusion you need to destroy, the illusion that effort equals importance. Because in real social dynamics, effort without boundaries translates into low perceived worth. And you've experienced this even if you never named it. Those moments when you showed up more than anyone else, cared more than anyone else, tried harder than anyone else, and somehow ended up being the one taken for granted. Not because you lacked value, but because you displayed it in a way that made it feel common. And common things are never chased. They are consumed and then ignored. So the first shift you need to make is internal. You need to detach your sense of worth from how much you give and start tying it to how intentionally you allow access to yourself. Because high-value individuals are not defined by what they offer, but by what they restrict. And that restriction is not loud. It is not arrogant. It is quiet, controlled, almost invisible, but deeply felt by others. Now understand this layer beneath behavior. Human nature does not reward logic. It responds to emotional signals, and the strongest signals are scarcity, uncertainty, and self-containment. When someone appears self-contained, meaning they are not seeking validation, not reacting impulsively, not over-investing in outcomes, they create a psychological gap, and that gap forces others to lean in, to observe, to interpret, to assign value, because the brain hates unresolved patterns. It wants to complete what it cannot fully read. And this is where most people fail. They over-communicate, over-express, over-reveal, thinking clarity builds connection. But in reality, too much clarity kills intrigue. And without intrigue, there is no emotional pull, no curiosity, no reason for anyone to invest attention in you beyond surface-level interaction. So you need to understand that being fully understood too quickly is not a strength. It is a disadvantage. Because it removes the psychological tension that makes people engage deeper. And once that tension is gone, you become easy to categorize. And once you are categorized, you are no longer interesting. You are just another predictable presence in their environment. Imagine a simple scenario. Two people enter a social space. One immediately tries to connect, asking questions, sharing stories, laughing loudly, filling silence with words. The other does the opposite. They observe first, speak less, move slower. They do not rush to be known. They allow pauses to exist. They let conversations come to them instead of forcing themselves into every interaction. Now watch carefully what happens over time. The first person might initially seem more friendly, more open, more likable on the surface, but that effect fades quickly, because there is nothing left to discover. Everything about them has already been laid out. The second person creates a different reaction, not immediate attachment, but curiosity. And curiosity is far more powerful than instant likability, because curiosity sustains attention, it invites projection, it makes people wonder. And when people start wondering about you, they start investing mental energy into you. And wherever attention flows, perceived value grows. This is not manipulation. This is alignment with how perception naturally works. And if you ignore it, you will keep losing without understanding why. So the first rule is simple but difficult. Control your availability, not as a strategy to play games, but as a reflection of a life that is not centered around external validation. You do not respond immediately to everything. You do not always make time for everyone. You do not allow your schedule to be dictated by other people's expectations. And this is where most people hesitate, because they fear being seen as distant or uncaring. But what they don't realize is that constant availability does not make you valued. It makes you predictable. And predictability removes emotional tension. And without tension, there is no perceived importance. So when you delay a response, when you prioritize your own time, when you choose when to engage instead of reacting instantly, you are not being rude. You are communicating something much deeper, that your time has weight, that your attention is selective, that access to you is not automatic. And this subtle shift changes how people interpret your presence without you having to say a single word about your worth. The second rule cuts even deeper. Stop over-explaining. Because every time you justify your actions unnecessarily, you reveal an underlying need to be approved, and that need weakens your position instantly. High-value individuals do not rush to clarify every misunderstanding. They allow ambiguity to exist, not because they enjoy confusion, but because they are not threatened by it. They understand that not everyone needs to understand them immediately, and more importantly, they are not emotionally dependent on being perceived correctly at all times. And this is where your discipline is tested, because your instinct will push you to explain, to correct, to make sure others see you in the right light. But every extra explanation chips away at your perceived authority, because authority does not defend itself constantly. It stands. It allows interpretation. It lets others come to their own conclusions. And ironically, those conclusions are often more favorable than anything you could have explained. Because when people build an image of you themselves, they invest in it more than if you handed it to them directly. The third rule is the hardest to embody. Detach from validation. Not in a way that denies human connection, but in a way that removes dependence on external approval as a source of identity. Because the moment you need someone to affirm your value, you give them power over it. And power, once given away, is rarely returned voluntarily. So high-value individuals operate differently. They do not reject validation, but they do not chase it. They do not measure their worth through reactions, likes, responses, or approval. They measure it internally, through standards, through discipline, through alignment with their own principles. And this internal anchor creates a kind of stability that others can feel, even if they cannot articulate it. And that stability is what makes them appear grounded, unshaken, and ultimately more valuable. Because people trust what does not fluctuate based on external input. They are drawn to what feels solid, what feels self-sufficient, what feels complete on its own. Now step back and look at the pattern again from a different angle. Value is not something you announce. It is something others conclude. And those conclusions are shaped not by what you say, but by what you consistently demonstrate through restraint, through control, through the ability to not react impulsively, through the willingness to leave space instead of filling it, through the discipline to hold back instead of overgiving. And this is why most people never reach high-value perception, because it requires subtraction, not addition. It requires you to do less of what feels comfortable and more of what feels unnatural at first. It requires you to sit in silence when you want to speak, to wait when you want to rush, to detach when you want to cling. And each of these moments builds a different signal, a signal that you are not driven by need, but by choice. And that difference is everything. So understand this clearly. Value is built through restraint, not effort alone, through absence as much as presence, through what you choose not to reveal as much as what you show, through the tension you maintain rather than the comfort you provide. And this tension is not about playing games. It is about respecting the psychological reality of how humans perceive worth. Because when you remove all tension, all uncertainty, all scarcity, you remove the very elements that make something feel important. And when something does not feel important, it is eventually ignored, no matter how good it actually is. So if you want to change how you are perceived, you must first change how you operate. Not by adding more effort, but by removing unnecessary exposure, unnecessary explanation, unnecessary availability. And as you do this, something subtle begins to happen. People start paying more attention, not because you asked for it, but because you stopped giving it away freely. And that shift, quiet and almost invisible, is the beginning of real perceived value. Everything comes down to this. Not what you show, not what you say, not how much you give, but how little you need. Because the moment you need less, everything about you changes in ways you cannot fake. Your voice slows down, your decisions become sharper, your presence becomes heavier, and people begin to feel something they cannot quite explain, a kind of quiet pressure, a silent authority that does not ask for attention but receives it anyway. And this is where most people misunderstand the concept entirely. They think high value is about status, appearance, money, or dominance. But those are only surface-level amplifiers. The real foundation is psychological independence, the ability to stand in any situation without seeking validation, without rushing to fill silence, without bending your identity just to be accepted. And when you reach that point, something irreversible happens. You stop negotiating your worth in small, invisible ways. You stop explaining yourself to people who have not earned that level of access. You stop reacting emotionally to every shift in someone else's behavior. And instead, you observe, you choose, you respond only when necessary. And this restraint creates a different kind of gravity around you. Not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable. Because people are not used to encountering someone who is not trying to get something from them. And that alone sets you apart more than any strategy ever could. If you want to be seen as high value, you must be willing to walk a path that feels uncomfortable at first. A path where you are not always understood, not always liked, not always included. Because the truth is, the more you detach from the need to be accepted by everyone, the more selectively you will be valued by the right people. And that selectivity is what creates real respect. Because respect is never given to what is universally accessible. It is given to what feels earned, what feels rare, what feels intentional. And you cannot create that feeling if you are constantly adjusting yourself to fit into every environment, constantly lowering your boundaries to maintain connection, constantly sacrificing your own standards just to avoid losing people. Because every time you do that, you are sending a signal, not with your words, but with your behavior. A signal that your identity is flexible under pressure, that your presence is negotiable, that your value can be adjusted depending on who is in front of you. And once that signal is perceived, even subconsciously, it changes how people treat you permanently. So the final rule is simple, but it demands everything from you. If you want to be high value, you must be willing to lose. Lose attention, lose approval, lose temporary connections, lose the illusion of being liked by everyone. Because holding on to those things requires you to dilute yourself. And dilution is the enemy of value. It weakens your presence, it blurs your identity, it makes you easier to ignore. And the irony is, the more you try to hold on to people by being everything they want, the faster you lose them, because there is nothing solid left for them to respect, nothing defined for them to anchor to, nothing distinct for them to remember. And that is why the shift you need to make is not external, it is internal. You need to become comfortable with being misunderstood, comfortable with being silent, comfortable with not reacting, comfortable with letting people come and go without chasing. Because when you reach that level of internal control, your external reality starts to reorganize itself around you. People either step up to meet your standard, or they quietly fade away. And both outcomes work in your favor. Because you are no longer operating from fear, you are operating from alignment. And alignment creates consistency, and consistency builds trust. And trust is the core of long-term perceived value. Most people will never understand this, not because it is complicated, but because it is uncomfortable. It requires discipline in moments where your instinct tells you to react. It requires patience when you want immediate reassurance. It requires silence when you feel the urge to explain. And most people fail in these small moments, not once, but repeatedly, reinforcing the same patterns that keep them stuck. They keep giving too much, speaking too much, reacting too quickly, and then they wonder why nothing changes, why they are not respected, why they are always the one investing more. But the answer has been in front of them the entire time. They are operating from need instead of control, from reaction instead of intention, from fear instead of stability. And until that changes, nothing else will. So read this carefully, because this is where everything either clicks or it doesn't. You do not become high value by adding more layers to yourself. You become high value by removing everything that signals dependency, the need to be liked, the need to be understood, the need to be included, the need to be validated. And what remains after that removal is something raw, something stable, something difficult to ignore, because it does not fluctuate based on external input. It stands on its own. And that is what people are drawn to at the deepest level. Not perfection, not performance, but certainty. The kind of certainty that does not need to speak loudly to be felt. So if you want respect, real respect, not temporary attention, not surface-level approval, but deep, lasting respect, you must become the kind of person who is willing to walk away from anything that requires you to lower your standard. You must become the kind of person who chooses silence over unnecessary words, distance over forced closeness, clarity over confusion, and discipline over impulse, because these choices, repeated over time, shape how people see you more than anything you could ever say about yourself. And here is the final truth, the one most people will avoid. You will feel alone at times when you start doing this, not because you are losing something valuable, but because you are shedding what was never aligned with you in the first place. And that process creates space. And that space can feel empty if you are not used to it. But that emptiness is not a loss. It is a reset. It is the environment where your real value begins to form, where your identity becomes defined by your choices instead of other people's reactions. And once you pass through that phase, you will never go back, because you will see clearly. You will recognize patterns instantly. You will feel when someone is operating from need versus control. And most importantly, you will no longer be pulled into dynamics that diminish you, because you will understand your position without needing anyone else to confirm it. So if you take anything from this, let it be this. The less you need, the less you chase, the less you explain, the more powerful you become. Not in a loud, visible way, but in a quiet, undeniable way that shapes how people respond to you before you even speak. And that is the difference between those who are constantly trying to prove their value and those who never have to. Watch this again, not to agree, not to feel motivated for a moment, but to observe yourself honestly, to catch the patterns you usually ignore, to notice where you give too much, where you speak too fast, where you seek approval without realizing it. Because awareness is the first shift, and without it, nothing changes. But with it, everything begins, slowly, quietly, and then all at once.